This episode is about Indigenous storytelling. Storytelling unites us, it brings us together. It is also a huge part of our culture as Indigenous peoples in this country. In this episode, we'll be hearing from author Jenny Dupuis, who wrote I Am Not a Number.
As we adventure out into the world and try to under this concept of truth and reconciliation, you're going to see a lot of titles of books and even some short stories and some long movies about life in the residential school. What is important about this is you will find consistencies in all of them. And what is unique about each and every story, they're individual people's journeys, because everything cannot be put in one pot and say we all suffer that. How we may have suffered all those traumas, but they were different for each and every one of us.
In this episode, we'll be watching a short film by Indigenous filmmaker Eve Ringuette. This powerful and touching story is about a residential school survivor, a child who attended residential school and chose to run away.
Je me rappelle pas être partie. J'étais dans la cour avec les autres, puis tout d'un coup, j'étais en train de courir vers la forêt. Je sais pas s'il y en a beaucoup qui ont essayé de me suivre. Je me suis pas retournée quand ils ont crié. C'était sûrement parce qu'ils se faisaient rattraper. J'ai entendu quelqu'un me suivre et je me suis cachée. J'avais peur qu'ils m'aient retrouvée. Je savais qu'il fallait aller vers le nord. Quand je verrai la rivière Chibou, je la suivrai jusqu'à chez nous. Le jour, il faisait pas trop froid quand je marchais. Mais le soir, j'avais vraiment très froid. Et un peu peur à cause des bruits et parce que j'étais tout seul. Un matin, j'ai entendu un bruit et ça m'a réveillée. Tommy s'était enfui lui aussi. Je l'avais déjà vu dans les couloirs, mais je le connaissais pas vraiment. J'étais juste très contente de plus être seule. J'ai dit à Tommy que j'allais chez moi pour voir ma mère. Elle avait un bébé dans son ventre quand les policiers sont venus me chercher. J'avais hâte de savoir si j'avais une petite sœur ou un petit frère. Tommy, lui, avait plus de famille, mais je lui ai dit qu'il pouvait venir chez nous. Ma maman s'occuperait de lui. On a marché très longtemps. Nos pieds faisaient mal, ils étaient tout enflés. On a attaché nos souliers serrés, puis on est reparti. Quand j'ai vu la rivière, j'étais excitée. Je savais qu'on était sur le bon chemin. À un moment donné, nos jambes étaient trop fatiguées. On n'arrêtait pas de tomber. J'ai pleuré, mais c'était parce que j'étais plus capable de continuer. Puis, je m'ennuyais de maman. Tommy m'a consolée. On s'est collé fort pour dormir, parce qu'il faisait plus froid que les autres soirs.
This wonderful book out there called I Am Not a Number. When I first heard about that book and I heard about the title, I Am Not a Number, it brought me back to when we first entered the residential school here in Hobbema. Given a number is part of a process of when we are first taken into the school. The first thing we do when we're processed, we're brought into the building, we are assigned dormitories, where you're assigned numbers. And the number will stick with you from the day you enter there until the day you leave. For me personally, I don't remember what my number was, but even though that number would have been on our clothes, our coats, our jackets, and our socks, our underwear, sleeping pajamas, all that. But that's all I could remember was that we had numbers, but what they were, I don't know.
What inspired me to write the book I Am Not a Number is I grew up, I grew up living in silence, meaning not knowing a lot about the history of my community or other communities across Canada. So in hearing my grandmother's story, we decided as a family that it was so important to break that silence and to share that story with our community, through literature, through books, through conversations, through community members, including survivors telling their stories and sharing their stories. It can really help to create understanding, and so that we could never do this again. We came up with the title through various conversations. We thought of various other titles like Behind the Hidden Walls, or something that showed that there was some kind of activities, inappropriate activities going on in the schools. But we felt that the story was so much more than that. And in the case of my grandmother, thinking about the resilience that she had, as well as her family as well too, and various parts within the book where she arrives at that school and her name is changed to a number, but in her mind she's constantly reminding herself that I'm not a number. Writing a children's book was something very new for me at the time. I didn't consider myself a children's author at the time, and I felt just having that confidence to begin to write the story, to work with my family to get the permissions, but then realizing that once you start writing, that you really have to write to the audience and to think about what needs to be learned through a storybook. What are the important pieces that you want to, what are the messages that you want to send to people? What is that history that you want to share? Because her story was so much longer, but you have to do it. In this case, it was a little under 3,000 words, I believe. So what do you do? So in this case, we choosing those elements. It's challenging because you want to give credit to her whole story and her whole truth. But on the other hand, you want to use it as a learning tool for people as well, to learn about the residential school system, and to doing it also in a really, really sensitive way, and in a way that's really age appropriate too. So thinking about, how do you talk about somebody who's being taken from their home? So in that case, we had the Indian agent arriving at the house, the one morning, knocking on the door to take the kids away. That was the start of it. And then thinking about all those components that came after, everything from, changing her identity and who she was, taking that all away from her, forcing her to leave that behind. But we wanted to make that a teaching moment about the idea of, the difference between, what people do, to take away a culture and how that could impact somebody in terms of their identity. The one part where people questioned, whether or not I should put it in the book or not, was when they tried to stop her from speaking her language one day with one of her friends at the school, speaking her Indigenous language, Anishinaabe. And the idea of how they chose to burn her arms and such for speaking that language. But some people would say, like, that's really difficult for people to hear about. But the reality is that was truth, and that's the the depths that people went to at that particular time to make sure that in her case that she wouldn't want to speak her language again. They didn't want them to be proud of speaking their language. They didn't want them to be proud of having those family connections or those cultural connections and such. So I think it's unpacking what was difficult is trying to unpack that, knowing that this book is going to land in my community. It's going to land to children and survivors and to families that may not have heard the story before. It's going to land with non-Indigenous people as well. And what are they going to do with that information? And what are they going to do in terms of what's their responsibility to make sure this never ever happens again, and that Indigenous children do feel pride, this sense of pride about speaking their language nowadays and following their culture or choosing that path if that's the path that they want to take. So you try to, it's challenging because you're thinking through a lot as you're writing, with a lot of hopes, and where that book lands, you leave that hope with other people as well to carry. I think for those that have read the book I'm Not a Number or are thinking about reading it, I think it's important to walk away and really think about not only what's your responsibility, but to really think about your own history and to ask questions about it, and to also think about what's available now, to help to support that change that's around you. There's many avenues to help with that revitalization and rebuilding of culture that was lost, that was forcibly taken away, that was banned through various laws and policies. And now we have, the doors are open in terms of those opportunities. And I would suggest, if you're a young person sitting there and you're trying to figure out your identity, is to take advantage of some of those those opportunities, and be part of that change.
Join me in thanking Jenny and Eve for sharing their beautiful, touching, and impactful stories with us. Kinanask Motin.